This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Jason Zeller. I'm with the Network Development Group, and I'm also a Fort Hays State instructor. We're going to do a little bit on the bio side of things, but today we're going to cover a day in the life of a NetLab Plus administrator. Our goal with this session is to get everybody familiar with the NetLab administrator functions, the things that it would take for you to be a NetLab administrator, or if you're currently a NetLab administrator, maybe some tips and tricks that you haven't learned along the way. This is an open webinar, so by all means, please ask questions. You can come off mute here, ask them in chat, Q&A, etc. We're scheduled for 3 hours, but we probably won't take up that entire time today. It generally depends on how many questions come through, audience participation, that kind of stuff. I will definitely try to stop at the top of the hours to give us a little bit of a break. Please remind me if I forget, as I like to get to talking and get to explaining things, and I tend to forget what time it is. This session will be recorded, so we'll be able to play that back, and you guys can get those recordings here after the meeting. So again, a little bit of feedback. My name is Jason Zeller. I began as a R&D technician at a small company, and then eventually moved to Network Development Group, where I worked for about 9 years as a senior product engineer. And then during that time, I was an adjunct professor, and now in 2019, I became a full-time professor responsible for both the undergraduate cybersecurity degree as well as my graduate degrees. In that background, I've been a NetLab administrator since 2005. I started actually as a sophomore in college, being a NetLab administrator. That was back when virtualization was just starting. So we moved from having no virtual machines in the pods to now having virtual machines in the pods. So I've been around for quite a while in terms of NetLab administration, and then obviously working for NDG for many years. If you guys have any questions during this session or during this webinar, you're more than likely, I mean, you can ask or send an email to my Fort Hays State email address. You're welcome to do that. You can also send it to our support team. Kind of depends on what your question is. If it's specifically related to NetLab or anything related to the content in NetLab, I ask that you email the support team because they are much faster at responding to you. My email address is there if you have any questions about my particular setup or something pertinent to the things that I show you at Fort Hays State University. If for some reason you're not getting a response here when the semester kicks up, and you know everybody in here is an instructor or administrator and knows how email goes, by all means, send it to support. Support will get on top of me and make sure that we have that. And I'll get you a support email address here in just a little bit. As a matter of fact, I'll put it in the chat here. And there'll be some documents that I'll refer to you to get from support as well. So, all right. So here's the agenda I have today. For those of you that are familiar with my webinar format, I say there's an agenda. It's honestly an open format, and it heavily depends on participant, the participation from the audience. So ask all the questions that you want. We'll go as long as you want. But these are just some key topics that I have listed down here. So we're going to talk a little bit about VMware and vCenter. We'll talk about the NetLab VE product, some hardware server upgrades and just hardware servers in general, and then how to do general pod deployment and layout. Again, please ask questions. I definitely need audience participation in order for this to go smooth. And I want to make sure that you get what you came to this webinar. You've dedicated some time here today to be here. So by all means, let me make sure that I get what you came for. All right, so as a background here, before I get started, just real quick, if you could use the raise hand button in the participants, how many of you are NetLab administrators or are starting to be one? Okay, good. So we got about 3, 4 people, 5 people. Great. So a good chunk of the audience is either going to be NetLab administrators or future ones. So if you're not familiar with the back end of the NetLab Plus infrastructure, we always start with what's called the management server. And that management server is going to house NetLab Plus VE. It's also going to house our vCenter. We're going to go into more detail here in a live demo. And then we have our host servers, and those host servers are what hold all our virtual machines down below. Those run ESXi as well. And that's what all your student pods and all the virtual machines and things that you create, that's where that's all going to be stored. There's a couple different topologies that you can use in your deployment. This one here references a DMZ, and this is actually how I have mine deployed here at Fort Hays. So we come in from the internet side into a site firewall, and then we have the campus LAN that's running there as well. That comes into a firewall in my location, which will then go down to a network that runs the infrastructure for NETLAB VE. And in that deployment guide and things like that, you can read, you will see we have our management host over here on the lower right-hand side that houses NETLAB VE, as well as the vCenter, and then all of our virtual machine pods over here to the left. You could also do it where you just have a router here with the campus network. This is another option. Just know that depending on how you go about deploying your system, we always require these days that one, NETLAB VE is always SSL encrypted. So you're going to need a certificate, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the NETLAB Plus Administrator interface. But then you're also going to need to make sure that if you have inside IP addressing, for example, you're using 192 or 172s, that you're going to need a one-to-one NAT going to the outside firewall and a DNS entry. So we can definitely go into that in more detail, especially for those of you that have questions. Definitely ask those. You can come out here to support and documentation. And then down here, you're going to see Lenovo server specifications and background info. So every so few, a couple years, we always give you latest up-to-date server specifications. Those specifications generally change based on the market. So for example, this one updated during 2020 because the pricing of different equipment had changed, and some things like the old servers and the processors, the RAM, et cetera, that we used to recommend had gotten cheaper over time. And there were some newer processors that were actually cheaper than the old ones. So we always try to keep these up to date for everybody, and you can always come out to our website, grab that same PDF and see if it's the latest one. If you've been with us for any length of time, you know that we used to support Dell servers, or recommend Dell servers, I should say. And we eventually got away from the Dell servers purely because the pricing was all over the board for a lot of our schools. Back when it was fairly standardized, it was pretty easy. But then they went to a new pricing model and new scheme based on the amount of hardware that you purchased, et cetera. So then we started partnering with Lenovo. And so our new server specifications are based on Lenovo. Doesn't mean that you have to use Lenovo. These are just approved specifications that we have for the NETLAB infrastructure. A lot of times you can take some of these specifications and move these over to another vendor if required. For example, say you're on a state contract, et cetera, and you have to purchase through a specific vendor, then we can work with you to make sure that you get the right specifications. On these servers, there's typically two different models, and we create at least three different models available for you. So we have a management server specification, and you can see those here. What's great about these new partnerships with Lenovo is you look at these part numbers up here, you can take that part number and tell any Lenovo authorized reseller that part number, and they can order this system for you. You don't go out and configure all the individual hardware. You just give them this part number. They should be able to pull those server specs. You don't want to try to create it from scratch because there's a lot of things that we don't list in here. For example, the individual part numbers, to make sure that you get the proper system. A couple of key notes on the management server. We moved to a 16 core setup, and that's because this particular processor had gotten fairly cheap and it was within the bounds of what we were looking for. This one also uses 128 gig of RAM. The big difference with the management servers is we still recommend that you have a RAID style configuration. So down here below, you're going to see that we still recommend that you have 8 2.5-inch drives and a RAID 5. This is what's going to purely house your vCenter as well as your NETLAB VE, and then also any backups that you want to do if you don't have any offsite backup. So that works fairly well. This flash that you see up above here, this little RAID system, this is purely for the install of ESXi. I'm sorry, this is the RAID card for this, but you will see that these two NVMe or SATA SSDs here is purely for installing ESXi. We don't actually utilize those for anything else. If you look at the advance up to the host server standard, and this is just a standard host server for deploying virtual machines, you'll see that the server specs are fairly identical, only we moved to NVMe drives for the storage. And this makes a huge difference in the increase in performance of storage. Again, up here, we're looking for reliability because we have NETLAB VE and vCenter, where down here, when we're dealing with student virtual machines, we want those NVMe drives. And if anybody's ever made the adjustment to NVMe drives, they know just how fast those things are. And the cost has come down dramatically on some of these early drives. We went from, recommending spindle drives to some SSDs, and now NVMEs are pretty hardened and tried and true. So you're going to notice that the default standard specification is going to have 384 gig of RAM, and you're going to have 2 of these NVMe drives. And then the only real change between that and what we classify as a high performance server is we bump up the processor to the 5218R, which gives us 4 more cores per processor. And then we also bump that RAM up to 768 gig. Notice that the NVMe drives are all the same, etc. A lot of people will want to put more RAM or faster CPUs in there. And while you can do that, it's usually a price cutoff. So for example, with this high performance server spec here, if I wanted to put in faster processors and more RAM to get a little more out of the system, it's actually cheaper for me to buy a second system. And not to mention, a second system gives you a little bit of redundancy and things like that in the event that one failed versus putting all your eggs in one basket. So that is the reason we cut these specifications where they are. It's based on the hardware. It's also based on the number of pods that this server can hold, as well as the amount of VMware ESXi API commands that we can execute to a single host. So there's a lot of thought that goes into these and building these server specifications out. We're not just willy-nilly picking anything. You'll notice that all these are set up to come with ESXi 6.7. Again, that's what we currently support. And in the future, we will officially support 7.0 as we get documentation. Does anybody have any questions over these server specifications? How many of you are still running older Dell 710, 720s? Kevin is, okay. And then, like, for example, Kevin there, and David, you guys are still running some of those older systems. I know, David, I know you've made the move to some of the SSDs I recommended in the past. Kevin, are you running any SSDs in those 710, 720s? Okay. David, you were asking the approximate cost for these servers. The high performance server is the latest one that I've purchased. As a matter of fact, I fully intended on deploying that here today during the webinar. But like a goof, I forgot to check the hardware once it came in, and it's been sitting in my office now for a few months. And there was some power supply issues that I needed to resolve. So it was my own fault kind of thing. It's not an issue with the server, it's an issue with my rack and the amount of power that I had ran to it. So the high performance one cost me around 16,000. That's usually what you can expect these days. And note that this one high performance server will replace, in my case, and I show you my infrastructure here in a little bit, it'll replace about 3 or 4 of the old 710, 720 servers. So there's that much more capacity and power in these newer ones. For if you are running the old 710, 720s and you're interested in moving to some SSDs to just get you by, I have done that in the past, and I know David has taken that recommendation and done it himself. But they're a great way to help you limp along a little bit longer with that hardware. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, Kevin, we can definitely cover that here today. And I can even demo what I did with my old infrastructure, because that's what I did. I couldn't afford these new servers right off the bat. So what I did was invest a little bit of money in some of the old R720s, brought them up to speed with some NVMe drives, which made a huge performance increase. And then now I'm able to slowly start replacing these servers with some higher end Lenovo's. Anybody else have any other questions related around hardware? Okay. So that's going to take me into the live demo spot. So what I do here is I usually run through all of my hardware and things that I have deployed on my side. I'm not going to say that any of this is perfect. My do as I say and that kind of thing, that falls pretty well with my deployments. I've been doing these kind of trainings for NetLab administrators for at least 9 years now. And there's some things that I still need to fix on my infrastructure. So my infrastructure is also extremely fluid in that I'm always running the latest alpha versions of NetLab VE for NDG. So not the betas that get released to everybody else. I usually run the alphas or pre-alphas. And that's purely so that we can get time on it with students to see if there's any bugs or issues, and we try to get those corrected before you ever get a beta version of NetLab. So a lot of administrators obviously are weary of going from production releases to beta releases. I can tell you if it's in a beta release, that means I have ran it through quite a while with most students. And my student load here varies anywhere from 300 to 400 out of one institution, and then there's about that out of the second institution. That first institution is on an 8-week rotation, so those students are constantly hitting the NetLab Plus system. So I usually get a fair sampling size of students to hit the system, give us some feedback, and always let us know if there's issues with the newer versions. So what you see on the screen here is my backend and my infrastructure. I've got a vCenter appliance. Now, I will preface this by saying that I am running 7.0 for the vCenter, and I'm running 7 for a couple of the hosts. Again, the reason I'm running this is I was running the pre-alphas and the betas so that we could test and make sure that 7.0 infrastructure was going to work with the NetLab VE system. But I also have a mix match of that. So I've got my management server. We can ignore this CSC option up here. That has nothing to do with this installation. This management server, I have 2 management servers, but I'm only utilizing the one. The second one is intended to be a replacement, as this is an original Dell R710. It's a little long in the tooth. And this is what holds all of my virtual machines that are needed for the NetLab infrastructure. So in my case, I have my NetLab VE vCenter. I got the vCenter running here in 7.0. I have the VE, which is the virtual appliance itself. And then I have a management console, which is actually what you see me remote into here. This is just a Windows Server 2012. It's actually going to get updated here this fall. And that's purely for me to be able to remote in and manage this on campus. Right now it's using like some remote desktop and things like that. However, that'll all go behind a VPN that I'm replacing the network infrastructure this fall. You'll also see a CTFD server running up there. It's actually a really lightweight Linux server that I run for some of my other stuff, and it doesn't have any effect on this infrastructure. You'll notice I keep backup copies of everything in here. So in my particular case, because I've been around clear back to where we were doing recommendations for SAN appliances and Synologies, I actually still have the SAN appliance. However, I don't use it for pods or anything else anymore. It's honestly used for more cold storage. So when I do backups of NetLab VE, for example, during upgrades, whenever I move to a newer version of VE, I always do a full clone backup. And then that full clone backup is actually set over on the SAN storage. And then if I ever need to retrieve it, I can retrieve it and pull it back up right away. Otherwise, that's where all my backups store. And I tend to save at least 5 to 6 backups. That's just my normal rotation. You can see the last one I did here was just at the beginning of the month. And then I deleted a bunch of other ones in between here. That's it for my management server. You really shouldn't have much more than vCenter and VE. The way we've sized these machines is for some additional services like a management console, but you don't want to run a bunch of other services on here. And the reason that I have it very limited is because this NetLab vCenter, the vCenter appliance itself is very particular to disk operations. And so if you start running a bunch of other resources on this server, the resources allocated to vCenter, if they're not good enough RAM, CPU, disk IO, that kind of thing, you'll start to notice performance issues pretty dramatically on the NetLab VE side. So don't really want to run a bunch of extra services over here. Then we get into the NetLab data center, and this NetLab data center is where all my host servers are located. So for example, I have this first one here, 11, which holds all of my Cisco hardware pods. So all the virtual machines for those hardware pods. That is what I keep on older hardware right now because there isn't a huge demand on there, but there is some demand on there. And this infrastructure will eventually go out and then hit all the racks that have all the Cisco MDP pods and the professional pods and the old telephony pods and stuff that I have hanging around with physical hardware. That's what that server is dedicated to. Then every server up to about 23 here. So 12, 21, 22, 23. These are a mix match of older hardware. So you can see I've got some 710s. I've got some 720s. The 720s are running 6.7. That's the latest version that they can run on the 720. The old 610s are actually running 6.5. That's the latest version that they can run. And then these last two servers down here are the new Lenovo high performance ones that we just talked about. So those are running 7.0 as I've been testing that and making sure that works great. And it worked fantastic. So I have a third server sitting here in my office that I need to get deployed once I get some more power ran to the rack. Anybody have any questions over this infrastructure? Every now and then I get some questions as to how I deployed it. So in my particular case, with this NETLAB infrastructure, my campus has all public IP addressing. So my network is allocated at a /24 of public IPs for the department. I take up about 5 or 10 of those just so I have them. And then the way I manage my NETLAB infrastructure is I currently have a Juniper firewall that does all the firewalling for the NETLAB infrastructure. So that's what provides NAT for the individual servers, as well as any internet access into my student pods that are necessary for, like, say, Palo Alto. That runs off a separate network. And so I can run that and the students can get IP addressing, et cetera. The Junipers are going to get replaced with some newer Palo Altos. Those are some old Junipers that are now EOL. So those are going to get replaced with some newer Palo Alto equipment. The reason I made the shift to Palo Alto was just so that as a NETLAB administrator, I could get some more insight as to what was going on, particularly with the pods that are needing internet access, that I can actually restrict those down, but I can also have a lot more logging now in the event that a student decides to go rogue or do something that they're not supposed to do on that network, that I have a way of tracking that back down to the particular student. Anybody have any questions over the NETLAB infrastructure? Great. Okay, so outside of that, what I'm going to do is run you through the NETLAB Plus administrator interface. And then again, if you have any questions along this way, please ask those. Let's see. So you're running two Dell R640s. Can you clarify the role of the management server versus the NETLAB server? So yeah, the management server, again, let me pull back up my infrastructure. So your management server is purely intended to house nothing more than your vCenter and your NETLAB VE. There should be no other virtual machines running on there. Obviously, I have some running here, but that's based on my infrastructure and I know what those servers can handle. We don't want to oversubscribe or put anything additional on here, as you will kill the performance on the server. It's actually why I need to move to this new server that's listed here. Then your actual host servers are going to be where your virtual machines are stored. And so all of these servers down here are where the virtual machines for all my pods are. So for example, this is running the forensics pods, and then I have my cyber ops pods, et cetera, on this host. Each host has a bunch of different pods all scattered across it. And then we'll talk a little bit about if you choose to load balance or put multiple pod types across multiple hosts, et cetera. Does that answer what you were looking for there, Wayne? Yeah, no problem. No problem. So this is the NETLAB Plus infrastructure, or I should say the admin interface. And I'm going to kind of walk you through the different buttons and how to get around in this particular place. So the main thing that you can look at on this dashboard, in the upper right-hand side, you're going to see your host name and IP addressing on the inside, et cetera. In that network settings, you're also going to be able to configure your SSL. So this will allow you to go in, set up your SSL certificates. Note that we support two different ways of doing SSL certificates. You can either go purchase those certificates from, say, Komodo or somebody like that, or you can use the Let's Encrypt service. And generally people are having used the Let's Encrypt. As a matter of fact, I stopped buying my SSL certificates and I just use the Let's Encrypt service. Let's Encrypt is free. In order to use it for free, it has to renew it every, I believe it's 60 to 90 days. But you don't have to touch anything as a NetLab administrator. So once you get this set up and you get everything in there with the Let's Encrypt service, NetLab will automatically go ahead and renew that certificate for you, deploy the new certificate, and set that up and get it running. So it's a great way for schools to not have to have that additional cost of an SSL certificate, which can be pretty pricey depending on who your vendor is and whether or not you need it for your specific domain. So strongly encourage you to use the Let's Encrypt service unless your school maintains that you have to have your own SSL certificates. Back here out on the main page, that takes us to a couple of things. So we're going to get to settings here in just a second. On the right-hand side, this is going to get you to your user logins. What's nice about this is in a real snapshot, I can see how many pods are in use, how many active reservations are here, as well as how many future reservations. I can click on Manage Lab Reservations, and I can see what's going on my system on the fly. This is handy as a NetLab administrator if I have a bunch of upgrades to do or I need to take this system offline, what students are currently doing, and if I can alert those students or if I have to temporarily do a reboot, etc., I can notify them and let them know. I can also click on logged in users and I can see the individual users that are in the system. I can actually disable all logins. So if I'm going to do some server maintenance or something where I don't want students to interfere or instructors, I can go ahead and disable that. I can also go through here and kick these selected users off as well and bump them out of the system. So it's real handy to do some NetLab administration things over here. This section's great for that. We have our system uptime, which is going to tell us how long the system's been up and running. Again, because I do so many software updates and things, my uptime on this particular side usually doesn't get too high. I can tell you on uptime of other equipment in the infrastructure, like the Cisco switches, the master control switches, I've had uptimes of 3 years on some of that stuff. So the system is extremely reliable. And the only reason I had to do an update on that is I had to change out power in my racks, had nothing to do with the equipment. So very, very reliable on that side. Down here at the bottom is another important piece for NetLab administrators to pay attention to. This is your current software version. And if you want to check for software updates, you can always come out here and click software updates and do a check to see what's out there. You also have your maintenance, and this is going to tell you how many days of maintenance you have left with NetLab VE or NDG in general. And so I encourage you to stay on top of that as well. That way you can get all your updates and your content and everything going out to your system. If you notice that I have a newer version here and something you can't get access to, again, it's because I'm running on a beta train. If you are interested in moving to a newer version or you're looking for information on what is in the software releases, I encourage you to come out here to the news, and you can also get some information off the blog. A lot of times we'll do some updates as to content that's coming out here. For the NetLab product itself, if you come out here to NetLab VE and then take a look at our, support, there we go, and tech support. There we go. And you can get documentation and things here. The biggest one's going to be this release notes and known issues. So this is for the NetLab VE system itself. You'll notice that, again, the production release is 21.1.2. I'm currently running 1.4. And you can get all the information as to the bug fixes and things going out. Again, we got different statuses for beta, etc. You'll see that content come out. So this is a good one to follow and make sure that you're keeping up with the latest updates. We also send emails out, especially when we move to production, etc. If you're wanting to move to like a beta version or something like that, if you email our support team, they'll inform you as to what's going on with that beta version, and they can potentially move you to it. All right. So across the top here, at any point in time, you always see this help button up here at the top. This is going to take you directly to our documentation. So yes, you can come out here to our website and you can get access to documentation, which you saw here. Coming up to support and documentation, you're going to get all this documentation here. But within the NetLab Plus product itself, we're actually going to be able to take you out to the individual installation guides, or if you're in a particular window, it's going to change that help button to specifically pull up what is in that window. All right, so starting from the top here, we have settings. This is where you can manage your NetLab license. It's also where you can set up those network settings we talked about. You can also change your appearance, and NDG encourages you to do this. So for example, you'll notice my little Fort Hays State logo up here. If I log out, you'll notice that my login page is a picture of our quad. And you can adjust all of this for however you would like to. So I encourage you to go in, adjust the background images and stuff, make it feel a little bit more like yours. Of course, I have to type in my information correctly. So very nice tweaks there. You can upload some images and they'll give you some information on how to adjust those login banners and where you might want backgrounds, etc. So you can kind of play with that a little bit. On news and announcements, this is a great way for you NetLab administrators to send things out to different communities or to systems. This one here is going to be system wide. You can adjust it on a per community. We'll talk about communities here in a minute. But this would allow you to, no matter what system they come through, either send a welcome message or in the news announcements. It's a great place for you to announce a maintenance window or something like that that'll cover all communities. And then last but not least is going to be the API settings. As a NetLab administrator, you may want to take advantage of the NetLab API. This is a Python API that allows you to interact with your NetLab system. You can typically do things more than what you can do in the UI interface. This is a great way for NetLab administrators to script out different processes. For example, instead of cloning one pod, you want to clone out 10, 20 pods. That's a great use of the API. You may want to pull statistics and data information from the API. There's a bunch of different reasons. So I won't cover great detail on the API, but shameless plug. If you are interested in the API and want to take advantage of those, we do have a webinar coming up on that next week. So I will show this real quick. So we do have a webinar coming up on the API. And this is going to kind of walk you through both how to set up the development and testing environment, as well as having some NetLab administrators share a bunch of scripts that they use. We just released a new version of the API, which will allow you to talk about or work with synchronous and asynchronous scripting, which will improve the performance just a little bit. You can use whatever Python IDE interactive environment you want. I prefer PyCharm, and PyCharm is free for instructors from JetBrains. So that's what I'm going to cover in the actual session, is how to set all of that up and get you up and running. So if you're interested, we'll see you next week. Okay. Now we have this log feature here, and I'll be honest, this log feature, it's really hard to pull anything from these logs. And that's purely because of the amount of content that comes back to the user interface. NDG is working on a new version of this log infrastructure. As a matter of fact, it's going to release some really cool tools I've been waiting for many, many years. But we'll be able to interact with the logs a whole lot easier. You'll be able to offport or, offset those logs or send them out to a syslog server, a bunch of other content. And you can even get the NetLab system to act as a syslog server. So lots of cool features are going to come to the logs, but for now, it's not the best tool. You can click in here, you can try to submit, but the problem is the amount of return here takes a while to crunch and pull all those log files. We've sped that up dramatically by putting that kind of information into a database as opposed to a log file. Alerts isn't currently used, but usage is, and this is something I use quite a bit as a NetLab administrator. In the past, I particularly used it for doing community reports. So in my particular case, I have a sister college that actually rents time on our NetLab system to deploy Cisco pods. They couldn't maintain their own infrastructure. And so under our license agreement, we're allowed to recoup the cost from them in terms of keeping the NetLab maintenance in there, as well as the Cisco hardware refreshes that we have to do, et cetera. And everybody knows that's dealt with Cisco hardware. It gets expensive when you have to do an equipment refresh. So we recover our costs there, which means I have several communities that actually utilize our system. And this is how I used to go in and test a few things. One, I would pull reports in order to see how many labs they did, how many students utilized the labs, et cetera. But I also used it for pods. And the main reason I used it for pods was it allowed me to go in and see how many pods were being used by the system and how many students, whether or not we were getting overloaded on the system. So this was a great way for me to go in and look. Like if I do this quick report here, you're going to see pod usage basically from the beginning of time of this VE system, all the way through now of everything within my default community, which is here at Fort Hays. So on each given pod, we can see how many hours they went through. A lot of times what I did, again, was for these map pods, I would find out just how utilized I was all the way down to the 3. So if this number was showing heavy utilization across 3 pods, that told me I probably need a 4th pod. Now, again, this is beginning of time and not per year. And so that's what I would look at, is on a per semester basis to see if they were getting oversaturated and maybe I needed to invest in another pod, particularly with hardware pods where there's additional cost. Now, the rest of these, those aren't near as important down here because those are mostly virtual machine pods. And if I need more pods, I can always clone them off, kind of thing. So great reporting feature. That usage is also there for those of you that are using your NETLAB system for grants. This is a great way to export information for your grant so you can show justification of how many learners you served, how many hours they actually participated, those kind of things. So really good to use that usage number. Then we get down into communities. I kind of described communities a little bit, but communities is going to be a block of users that are separate from another block of users. It's the easiest way to describe it. So the idea here is like my default community is Fort Hays State University, but I also have like Park University who's utilizing our system, and it keeps all of their instructors and all their students separate than the Fort Hays login and Fort Hays setup. So that allows me to set community administrators over there. It allows me to set a few things over there for instructors, but it keeps all the student accounts completely separate from one institution to another. And you can't overlap between the two. So if I got a student that is here at Fort Hays and they use their Fort Hays email address, they cannot register an account in the Park side and they're with their Fort Hays email address. So keeps everything separated so that you can have multiple communities. Now, I utilize my system for some high schools. When the pandemic hit, that was another reason that I set up some communities, gave some local high schools and community colleges, et cetera, access to our system so that they could get past the hump during the pandemic. And then, of course, I set up different camps and I've done different systems. So that's why you see so many in here. Most schools are just going to have the one community. It's just going to be whatever institution they have, unless they're sharing their NETLAB system with more than one community. On the account side, this is where you as a NETLAB administrator can go in and create student accounts, or maybe you want to create instructor accounts. You could do that here. You can create them one by one. So you can go to add accounts and you can add them one by one to the system. You can specify initial passwords and what classes you want them assigned to. Or you can use our import feature, which is what a lot of instructors will use, or administrators. And this will allow you to take a CSV import. This can come directly out of your LMS system. So like, for example, I use Blackboard here at Fort Hays, and I will go into my class at the beginning of every semester, export my list of students, add them to the NETLAB system. And then if they have existing accounts, it would allow them to utilize and enroll them into my section. Now, I don't utilize that feature anymore because I utilize our new LTI integration, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. If people are interested in the LTI integration, but that has completely replaced me having to create user accounts, create instructor accounts, manage, student accounts off and on, manage passwords, all of that. Everything's handled by LTI now. So that's definitely a huge feature that's been released, and that's something that I like to use. So with that, it sounds like at least some of you are interested. So what you do is you come into a community here, and on your individual community, say I use something like this one here, you're going to get an option to hit edit, and then you will set up LPI keys and LTI keys here. This is going to allow you to integrate with different LMSs. So today we work with Blackboard, Moodle, and Canvas, but there's also offshoots that will actually work with our system as well. Those are just the main 3 we support. So I know some people have used Docebo and a bunch of other ones out there for other institutions. In theory, as long as it follows the LTI standard practice, it can be used. Sometimes there's some quirks. But what this allows you to do is you set up this information with your LMS, and then when you go in and create classes, for example, if I look at one of my default classes here, like my test class, I can set up all the content that I want in there. Now, again, this is testing everything. But once I get all my class content set up and I add myself as a instructor and a lead, I don't have to add students to this class. I just go to export LTI cartridge. I import that into the NETLAB or the the LMS interface, for example, here at Blackboard. And then once I bring that in, it actually brings every lab content line by line into my system. And I can show you a little bit of what that looks like. The great thing is one, this allows me to manage everything through my LMS. It also allows me to pick and choose any content that I may want to deliver during certain weeks. I can put direct links to the labs. And when a student clicks on that link, it immediately kicks them over to the NETLAB system. It authenticated them based on their login with the LMS. So now I don't have to create accounts on the NETLAB system. I don't have to use passwords anymore. Everything's authenticated through whatever LMS that they have. And then the additional beauty of that is there's the ability to enable evaluation, which means it will detect whether or not a student actually attended the reservation. And then if they spend at least 5 minutes in that reservation and actually participated, AKA move the mouse and type on the keyboard, it would give them back a full amount of points. So if I set that lab worth 10 points, it would return 10 points back to the LMS and put it in the gradebook. That's actually worked fantastic. And so I've moved a lot of instructors over to the LMI or the LTI LMS integration, as it's taken a huge load off them every semester. It also allows them to lay out their class quite a bit easier. If you want to see some more demo on that LTI, I can definitely do that here a little bit today. But I also have some videos that you can email our support team, and they can show you some demonstrations I did at a workshop out in California this year. The demo in great detail of that LTI LMS integration. So we talked about here classes. This is where you go in, set up your classes. You could do this as an administrator. You could also do it as an instructor. I tend to let my instructors create their own class. They just have to follow a certain naming convention. So that doesn't work very well in this one. We're getting there where I'm getting instructors to follow it. But for example, over here, it's very particular as to the naming structure. And the reason for that naming structure is primarily on their side for billing, so they can match things up to course numbers, et cetera. But it's best if you can get your instructors to use some kind of naming structure that makes sense for your particular institution. User logins, this is kind of an extension of what we saw over here. This is going to allow you to see who's in and running, and then you can also disable those. Okay, so we're coming up at the top of the hour. I'm going to take a 5-minute break here. Just let some people get some drinks, use the restroom, grab some coffee. Hopefully I haven't put you all to sleep, but I will pause this recording, and then we're going to come back here in 5 minutes. I'll cover this pods and infrastructure as well as the content section, because this takes a little bit more. If you have anything else that you would like me to cover, by all means, throw that in the Q&A, throw it in the chat. You're more than welcome to come off mute and talk about that as well.
When love comes in, ooh la la la. Love comes in, ooh la la la. When love comes in, ooh la la la. Love comes in, ooh la la la.
All right, so we'll go ahead and return and get going here again. Um, I did throw a link out in the chat, which is to a YouTube playlist for a conference that I did earlier this summer. Those first couple videos, I believe it's video 1 or video 2, really goes into depth on the LTI integration, particularly with how I use it and interact with my institution. So I demo it for all my classes and everything that goes in there. And that's, I believe, in day 1, day 2. You'll also see Wayne linked out there to our LTI integration document, and that definitely covers that. And I cover that in those videos as well. All right, so moving our way here, I'm going to actually jump over pods and infrastructure and come down here to content to get started. So we have a course manager that's down here. This is where you're going to install the content to your system. So if you're not familiar again with all the content and everything we have out there, you can come out to our main website, go to NETLAB Plus, and you can see our full content list. And you can see all the different vendors that we support and the different content. Once you've decided that, hey, I really like that one, that's the one I'm going to install. Every one of these has an install guide. So you come out here, you click on cybersecurity, ethical hacking version 2. And if we look at the documentation for this one, we look at topologies, ethical hacking V2, and we have this pod and install guide. And that's going to walk you through how to set up this pod, where to download the virtual machines, any kind of licensing information. All of that comes from this pod install guide. But as part of that, it's going to have you enable the content. And that's what this section is here. So you can see the content I have in my system. If I want to add other courses to my system, I can come down here and add other content. Now, this is the content that's available from NDG and the content that we distribute to all of our customers. So you can come out here and grab a wide range of content that's out there. The next two are pod and lab designer. These are where you can create your own custom pod and lab designs. If you're interested in these in more detail, I encourage you to email our support team. They can get you the videos from last week, as we did a 3-day long webinar on doing pod and lab designs and how to build virtual machines, etc. So if you missed that and you're interested in that content, by all means, email our support team. We will get you the links to those videos. And then last but not least is just file manager. This is where you can pull out student log files, etc. If they've saved configuration files for their routers and switches, you can go in and pull that content here as well. Okay. So that gets us up to the pods and infrastructure. Pods, this is where you're going to be deploying your pods. And as a NetLab administrator, this is where you're probably going to spend your most amount of time. So you can see I have a wide range of pods here. I've got anything from hardware Cisco pods through a bunch of different virtual machine pods all the way down through here. So I offer quite a bit of content. It's actually fairly cleaned up right now as I'm getting ready to go into the fall semester. To clone pods and do all those actions, all of that's greatly outlined in our pod and installation guide. So it's going to walk you through setting up your initial pod as well as setting up the clone pods and how to go through and clone different pods. So for example, if I want to clone my packet tracer pod that I have here, I can go down to clone pod. I can set a new pod number, give it another name. I can name it whatever I wanted. My rule of thumb on deploying and doing naming structures is I tend to include the name of the host that it's deployed on. So you saw my IP infrastructure here. This is host 23. And then I have, a main name there. And all that does is allow me to know where this pod is quickly identified, where it's deployed. I can see that in the pod name. And then I do that the same with the virtual machines. They're all kind of there. Some of my infrastructure is set up that way. Some of it's not. You can see some of this older ethical hacking stuff is not that way. In the newer setups, once I got newer hardware again, then I started moving to this, as that's what we do on the infrastructure of NDG Online. We've done that for many, many years. I just haven't moved that over to my NetLab here. So you can clone these pods out. You can configure pod ACLs and such. So pod ACLs, if you're not familiar with that feature, that allows you to specifically assign a pod to a given community, to an instructor, to a student specifically, or even a team. And so the way I've utilized that in the past is, for example, these 3 pods, or I should say 5 pods up here that are MDP pods, these are specifically assigned to the Park University community that I demoed earlier. And then these down here are assigned to the Fort Hays State University ones. Now, some of these will overlap. For example, if I need more pods over here for some reason, I may go ahead and turn these on and disable the pod ACLs. But normally there's a pod ACL setup in here. We can look at the configure pod ACL. Now, these are currently assigned. You can see that this one doesn't have a pod ACL, so it actually floats between two universities. So Park 5 does. But if we go and look up here at like Park 1, we can see that there is a pod ACL, and that one's assigned specifically to Park University. Where else I use those is we had a data team pod, which was a pod that was designed for our MIS students that were doing SAP HANA training. And so what he did was he assigned those out to individual teams, and he had all letters of the alphabet, so A through Z. And then he assigned those students to those teams. And then so that individual team pod would be only granted access to that particular pod that matched with their title. So I don't have any of those in here because we actually had some hardware issues there and I had to replace those. But I have all these other ones are pretty much open to everybody. That's kind of the pod section. I can go into more detail if there's something specifically you're here to look for. I can definitely do that. The virtual machine infrastructure, this is where you're going to maintain all of your virtual machines and your host servers. So generally when you get started here, you're going to go into data centers. You're going to add your data centers to the NetLab system, and then you can add your hosts from those data centers. So we can see all my individual hosts that I talked about in my backend. We can see all those in here. And then once you have your hosts in, then you can import those virtual machines that are necessary into your virtual machine inventory. And so the virtual machine inventory usually gets quite large, depending on how many virtual machines you all have set up out there. You'll need to kind of scroll. At all of these systems, if you're not familiar yet with the new VE side, we have these handy search fields at the top. That saves a lot. So if I type MDP, I can see all the virtual machines that are associated with my multi-device pods, and I can easily come in and manage those or do anything different. We can see where they're assigned to, what host they're currently assigned on, and different roles that they're set up to. What's also nice is you can come out here and see the PC names of them on the inside, but you can also see whether they're clones and who they're clones of. So if I come out to here, I can see that I have a parent master VM that I'm dealing with a link clone for this particular pod. Down here at the bottom, you can see your licenses. So this is going to help you with your VMware infrastructure. You can't change the license, but you can at least come in here and check the expiration dates. So instead of having to go into your vCenter appliance and chase that down, you can do that with a quick check here on the NETLAB infrastructure. And then lastly is the system-wide virtualization settings. This isn't honestly used as much as it used to be. It's on when you're sharing virtual machine infrastructure with more than one NETLAB system. This is when you would adjust this setting. And those are in very extreme cases where somebody's got a bigger infrastructure than more than one NETLAB VE appliance. Control devices, this is all dealing with Cisco hardware. So this is where you're going to add your control switches. So in my case, I have a master control switch up here, which is what connects directly to my ESXi host. And then I have individualized rack switches here. So these are two 48 port switches, one for each rack. I actually have a third rack here that just hasn't been implemented. And then each one of these that comes down goes to an access server. This is going to be the console connections for all of those Cisco devices. So I have one of those per rack, and then I also have PDUs. And the PDUs are your power distribution units. This is what's going to turn off and on the routers and switches for you in a reservation. And so I have those kind of evenly split between the two racks. There's four PDUs per rack. All of that comes in, and then last is going to be this lab device images. This is going to be where you can upload certain images and you can have NETLAB recover. This only works for certain devices, but there is ways that you can go in and test different recoveries. So that's the NETLAB Plus administrator guide. Generally, where I go with this type of thing now is really asking questions of you guys, or hopefully you have questions of me, as to what you would like to see. Like, why did you come today? Is there something I can cover in more greater detail? Is there something you're struggling with as a NETLAB administrator? So by all means, please reach out in the chat or the Q&A. You can also come off mute. You're more than welcome to come off mute. Let me add these last couple ones here that joined a little later. But you're more than welcome to come off mute, ask questions, and we can go. So I'll start here. Let's see. Ahmet, what did you want to come for this week? What is it you were specifically looking for? Yeah, good question, David. So you were talking about the LTI and the LMS integration. How easy was it in Blackboard? For my particular institution, it was very easy and straightforward. So I go in here to my community, I click on my community default, and then I would get my LTI consumer key and my shared key. I give that information over to my LMS administrator. And what they do is set up an LTI tool provider that authorizes anything coming from labs.fhsu.edu with that shared key and password. That's all set up so that I, as an instructor, all I have to do is come out to a community. For example, if I come out and look at one of my classes this fall or this last spring, and I taught forensics, or firewalls would have been one of these. So here would have been a systems forensics. In the content, I added NDG Forensics 2, come out to settings, and I go to export LTI cartridge. Then what I need to do is log into my LMS system here. So give me just a second. Get through all the layers of authentication here. Okay, so this is my LMS. When I come into my courses with Blackboard, if we take a look back at my spring courses, we talked about forensics, and you can see that forensics section here. So once I've exported that LTI cartridge, I simply come in here and go to my packages, import package. Inside this import package, I click on this. I can then browse out to the LTI cartridge that I saved from NETLAB. And then once I brought that in, I can come in and select the content that I want to bring in. Once you do that, you're going to be left with something like this over here on my left-hand side, which is the systems forensics. You're going to see a configuration tool, which just makes sure that everything's working with the LMI and LTI integration that you're familiar with. You click on forensics, and then you're going to have all the labs from that forensics content. Then what I do is, like, say for this particular lab, I go ahead and I can move that content into the individual sections of my learning modules. So for this particular course, for example, in module 3, you can see that they have lab 3, lab 4 all put in here. I have them do reports. If they click on lab 3, it immediately kicks me out to the my NETLAB installation. So you can see it came out here. What they do is they can go into lab reservation. They can schedule it for themselves. And you can see it takes them right into the scheduler. I didn't have to log in. I didn't have to change anything. They just pick a pod and a time. So I hit submit. And I'm off to where I can go ahead, enter the lab, and go ahead and continue on with that content. Once I end this reservation, it's going to go ahead and send that information back to the LMS if I have it set up to do that. And then it would go ahead and jump into the grade book. I can actually see whether or not that student completed this particular lab. Now, it's not going to make sure that they did every single step. All it's doing is checking to see, one, did they go into the reservation that they attended or they scheduled, and that they actually participated for about 5 minutes. There's no timers or anything else that you can change at this time. It's just a rough way of making sure that a student performed the lab, or at least entered into the lab. So let's see, you've got over 200 students now set up, manually entered. Will I lose them? You won't lose them, David. What will happen is they're going to create different accounts. So on my NETLAB system, if I was to look at my user here, accounts, you're going to see that some of these names are the actual usernames, and then you're going to get some that have the @fhsu.edu. And those @fhsu.edu accounts are the ones that get authenticated through the NETLAB system. So all your old students will have their old accounts still on NETLAB. But from here on out, everything else will get authenticated with the LMS. And that's really handy, because then if you have students, or in this case, instructors, that don't move over to LTI, and so you end up having some that are using LTI, some that are not, they're going to have two different accounts. They're going to have one that is the LMS account, but again, they don't have to touch or know passwords or do anything. They just click on it directly out of the LMS. Once they click on a link like what I showed you here, module 3, they click out on the lab, it's going to sign them in and take them on and go. When you go to the other way, they're going to have to go to, like in this case, labs.fhsu.edu, access the system with their username and password that they have for the old setup. I strongly encourage you not to do a balanced deployment, so to speak. In other words, don't have instructors that are using LTI and some that are not. Either do it all or don't do it. And the reason for that is if I come out here and say I have another NETLAB login, right? If I go out to labs.fhsu.edu, it's going to come back and tell me you can only access this from an LMS. And that's because it ties a cookie here to let the student know that you don't have a login. So there's no reason for you to go to labs.fhsu.edu. You need to go back to your LMS of whatever that is. Now, if I'm a student and I have an instructor that's using LMS and one that's not, then I have to come in as a incognito tab for my instructors that are not using the LMS LTI integration. Then I can come in, bypass that cookie, and be able to log in. So it runs into some student confusion if you try to run them both at the same time. I did that early on, obviously, to test and make sure. I've been running the LMI LTI integration for over a year now, and it works flawless. I mean, I've converted every single class I teach over to it. That demo and the videos that I showed you there, I walk you through my entire program, both undergrad and graduate. I explain how I use NETLAB, what content I use for each individual courses. All of that is in those videos. So yeah, all the old accounts still stay on the system. They're beneficial. Like, so for example, I teach in my class here, right? And so now that's using all the LMS features and things like that. But I also have classes on my NETLAB system that are purely for students to go back and do additional training after they complete the course. So if they're, took my spring semester course, but during this summer, they're going to come in and they need to do additional training to go take the cert. Then I create a different class on NETLAB. They have the traditional login style. That way they can come in and practice their labs to go do their cert since it's past the semester. As most LMSs, you usually can't access prior classes once that semester is over. In my case, I could change a setting to do that, but I try not to do that. Otherwise, the student's main screen will fill up like this, right? So if they see all their current courses, then they're going to see all the different courses they're a part of. Unfortunately, I teach a lot of classes. So. All right, let's see, finishing up summer classes, A+, don't want to bugger the system. Yeah, so you can continue doing what you're wanting. You can set up the LTI integration and it's on a per class level. So your class could either use it or not use it. Once you have it enabled for the system, it's just possible to use it. So. Anybody else have any other questions on NETLAB administration? There's some newer faces and names in here. Is anybody, there we go. So let's see here. Now to teach other instructors. Yeah, the thing is, at first they're going to be a little hesitant to move over to the LTI integration, right? It's a new step for them. But once they find out that they no longer have to add student accounts, they don't have to deal with password resets, they don't have to deal with anything like that, my attendance or my uptake on being able to use the feature went dramatically from instructors, particularly because sometimes they don't want them to do all the labs, right? Well, if you come through a normal NETLAB login, they're going to see all the labs. And, if they're dealing with Cisco labs, there's a lot of labs out there or something like that. And the numbers are very similar to one another, right? So what I do is, as you can see in like my other courses, this fall courses, I haven't set them up. But they can come into here to like say the firewalls course and it's broke out in the individual modules. So these modules are released throughout the semester. And that way they only have access to do the labs that are pertinent to that particular section. Now, once that section's passed, then it's available for the student. So if they're a week behind or something, they can still go out here and do the labs. But this is nice to kind of organize it and clean it up. And the students are already familiar with their LMS, right? They have to use it. So it's nice to just slip the labs in there. They no longer have to have an additional login or go to a particular website. They just click the link and immediately kicks them out. They can make a reservation and start off. Let's see. One of our instructors is reporting that students sometimes have issues with PCs powering up in the preloaded lab. The PC should be on. They're reporting the issues of PCs getting the same MAC address when they do the power on. If this question is out of the scope, nope, that's a great question. So if they are getting the same MAC address, then I'm guessing that you had a setting on your infrastructure when you cloned out the virtual machines, that particular interface should be set to automatic. So that's generally the case. So for example, and it's really important on Windows and Linux PCs, really. When you do a clone, you have a master clone. And if you're going to do a link clone off of that, so that you have multiple clones of that, then you want to double check your MAC addressing that's going through there. Now, if you're deploying a pod from us, say forensics, right? The pod installation guide will walk you through and make sure that you have all the appropriate MAC addresses set for that particular virtual machine. And when you clone that pod off to a second pod, because they're on two separate networks, then you shouldn't have that cloning or that MAC address cloning issue because they're two totally separate networks. However, if you made the original clone from like, say, the Cisco VM, right? Because we just distribute one VM, we don't distribute 3 VMs for PC A, B, and C. So what you typically do is you clone it off, but you change the MAC address to automatic so that it changes with every clone. And that way you don't have a conflicting MAC address. I'd have to know more about your particular setup there, Wayne, but that's generally the case of when I've seen that issue. Is it's a clone thing and it was probably set to a static MAC and it needed to be a automatic MAC. As far as the PCs not powering on when they should, is there any error messages that you're getting down below here? So there's a couple things that you can do as a NetLab administrator that's handy. You can watch your virtual machine infrastructure here, but that's sometimes really hard to follow. So the best way to start troubleshooting that type of interface, get this pulled back up here, is going to be if you go into the pod itself, make a reservation, and then see what's happening. You will get this filtered log down here. So this is going to bring you all the information that you get out of your vCenter that actually gets imported into this log system down here, as well as what NetLab is doing to try to execute those commands. So that way you can come in and say, okay, for some reason a PC didn't start up, like I've got some errors here, right? This one's saying that it can't power off that device. Well, it's because it wasn't even powered on. But you can come through and do these logs. You can get detailed information. And then if you really need detailed information, you can click on the task ID and it will go ahead and give you up even more information as it's coming out there. So I definitely need to come in and do that. And this is off some older stuff. That's why they're not showing up.
Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, what was that, Wayne?
I think I was saying thanks.
So like I said, support will definitely help drill into it a little bit more with you, and I can even drill into it. But my guess, based on what you're saying and all the years that I've been doing administrating, the Mac clone thing happens to me all the time on Cisco. If I forget to set that to an automatic when I clone it out, that causes that problem. You'll also have to change the host name, right? So you want to have PCA, PCB, PCC. And so the way I do that on my NetLab system, if we take a look at my pods, say for Park, I have all these, or just in general, I have all these MDP pods, right? So what I do is I only have 3 master virtual machines. I've got the one that comes from Cassia when you download the virtual machine. So let's go take a look at my infrastructure here. This will be easier to describe. Okay, so I have this Cisco Win 10 base, and this is the one that comes from Cassia. It's all set up with all the software and everything needed in there. Then I clone that out for my MDP pods, and so I have my master MDP pods. So you can see here, I've got MDP. I cloned that original one out 3 times, and these are full clones, not link clones. I cloned that one out 3 times with PCA, PCB, PCC. Then I go into each one of these. I make sure that their MAC addresses are all different just by simply looking at the network adapter and making sure that the type is set to automatic, or this MAC address here, like this is the static MAC. But if you actually come in and look at the settings, we can see that on this one, I have it set to automatic. So now that I've cloned that off 3 times, I go in and change the host name on each one of those systems. And then I do snapshots on each single one of these, the Golden Master snapshots. Then from each one of these, I actually clone out link clones for all my Cisco pods. So for every MDP pod that you see up above here, the FHSU ones, as well as all these Park ones, this PCA is all going back to this master PCA that I created for MDP, which is right here. So I take this, I clone it off for one for every pod type for all the A's, then I go back and do the B to all the B's and C to all the C's. And the reason for that is it saves resources so that my storage is only doing these 3 masters for the MDP pods. And then I also have all the link clones going off to the second drive, which is the standard setup on most of these hosts now. And that comes back to using NVMe drives and RAID drives and that kind of stuff. Great question, Wayne. Anybody else have any other questions or content that they were wanting to see today that I haven't covered? As Windows 10 changes, do you update your PCs? I don't, Wayne. For most of what I do, once it's deployed, unless there's a new version coming out from Cassia for like the Cisco pods, for example, I don't update. There is going to be an update when it comes to the CCMP pods. There's, before we were able to use one Cisco image for basically any Cisco pod. That changes with CCMP. So for those that are deploying any CCMP pods, they have a custom Cisco image for that. It's actually much, much larger, as there's a nested virtual machine inside of it. And so that's the only time I update. Otherwise, no, some of these are the original images before. Yeah, it's different and huge. I tried to shrink it as much as possible, but with that inner VM in there, there's just no real good way to do that. There again, though, if you use that model of cloning like I just showed you, it doesn't take up as much physical storage, once you get the link clones and things out. Yeah, I wish there was a better way to do that. Unfortunately, for the small amount of labs that are in the CCMP content that actually uses that VM, it was borderline trying to justify using it. But there's some good virtual machines. There's some good labs with that. With the Encore series, the Anarzi series, I am still working on. Hopefully we have that here within the next week or two. Anybody else have any other questions or content? David have to run. Yeah, no problem. No problem. Like I said, we're kind of at the end here, so it's really just up to questions that people have or discussion topics. And once those start to run dry, then I'll go ahead and end the session. Some other topics that tend to come up during these is migration. How do you upgrade? How do you go from, ESXi 5 to 6 to 7? So these days with the newer versions of ESXi, always on your vCenters, the biggest tip that I can give administrators is never fight a vCenter. In other words, if it crashes or starts throwing errors or bugs, don't sit there and try to troubleshoot it. Just deploy a new vCenter. Deploy it with the same IP address as the old one, the same username and password, and then delete the old one and plug this one back in. Add your ESXi host back underneath where it belongs, and the NETLAB system will go back up and running. That's something that I've learned over the years of doing all this, is fighting a vCenter, trying to repair it, trying to do that kind of stuff. It just never works. Never works. So thankfully, because of the way NETLAB utilizes vCenter, that's the best way to do that. It works the same way with upgrades. So for example, I've had a vCenter 6.5 here. When I wanted to test out 7, I just deployed a new vCenter 7 out here, used the same IP address, the same username and passwords, shut off the old one, turn on the new, added the ESXi hosts in appropriately with the different data centers. Everything goes back to normal. So you don't have to really tweak or adjust any settings. As for the ESXi hosts themselves, during that upgrade process, I used to strongly recommend just doing it from scratch, wipe the server, get rid of all the virtual machines and just start over, because that's faster and tried and true. However, starting with 6.5 to 6.7 and those, I've had really good luck using a USB drive and just upgrading to the newer version. That was never the case in the old 4.2 days, and so I was always reluctant to suggest people do that. But in the newer versions, like I said, I just put the newer version of ESXi on a jump drive. Always make sure that you're grabbing the server version that you're dealing with. So for example, if you're dealing with Dell servers, go get the Dell VMware ESXi from Dell. Same way with Lenovo. I know here recently, VMware will actually give you access to those individual vendor ISOs as well. But always get your vendor ISO. And that helps eliminate any driver issues, as there was a time where if you didn't use the right one, you were going to have a lot of driver issues, particularly with RAID cards. And I always kind of do a step incremental update as well. So for example, when you're seeing these hosts down here, I incrementally stepped up from 5.5 to 6, then 6 to 6.5 to get this host up to the last version, right? 7.10 is only going to be a 6.5. Same way with my 720s, I incrementally stepped them up to where I got to 7.6.7 U3, and then these last ones are brand new deployments with 7.0. And there's really no reason to upgrade the ESXi unless you absolutely need to. Most of the time, you're just upgrading a vCenter so that you can have a newer version of the software. So for example, when I want to add these new hosts and have 7.0 running on them, I have to make sure that my vCenter is also running 7.0. vCenter always has to be at or higher than the ESXi host underneath of it. You mentioned backing up a NETLAB VE before. Updating it is possible to back up directly to an external USB RAID box. An external RAID USB box isn't as easy, because the only way that you can back that up is you're going to have to come into something like this management console that I created that I'm in here now. So I would have to pass through USB. I would have to pass through USB clear on into the virtual machine. And then from within my client here, I would have to download that and then send that over to USB. So I strongly recommending have some kind of network-based storage if at all possible. Again, we used to use Synology boxes. So I've got some really powerful Synology boxes here. You know, these are the rack mount nice ones, but you can get some fairly cheap Synology boxes these days. And I'll be honest, I'm fairly a Synology fanboy, because they just work. And I've used them in enterprise. I use them at home. I install security systems, camera systems, and I always use Synology products and everything in there, as for the NAS side of things. So the ones that are easy for you to use here, let's see, you can use the DS models, and then you can always go out and even get the smallest one here, like a DS18, which is going to have network-based storage, and then you can offer that available to your ESXi host as a not an NTFS storage, but a this is escaping me. Give me a second here. Let's see, 10 configure NFS, just NFS storage. So that's what I have here. If we go look at my data stores, we see that I have FHSU NFS. This is just going over to a small Synology. You can pick up one of these like a DS218, throw 2 hard drives in it. This is a 2-bay. If you want more storage, you can go jump up. But I put in like 2 drives into that series. You can obviously get the better performance ones if you want them, like a 220 plus or something like that. Put 2 hard drives in them. Synology makes it really easy to set up NFS, and then you can just send those backups to it. And that's a great way to back up your vCenter, your VE when you need to, that kind of thing. The biggest one I back up is just my NETLAB VE. Before every software update, I always do a full clone backup. That way I can always revert back. I've got too many students utilizing the system to really have that much downtime, especially a VE downtime. So just an offsite backup. And you can get into, you know, these will cost, I think I just set this up for a security system. So this will cost about $200. And then if you put, say, 2 6 terabyte drives in it, you're going to have, $150 a piece in the drive. So 300, 500 total, something in that. You can get a pretty small unit set up like this. And you can use that for other things in your NetLab infrastructure if you need to. The ones I'm using are the old rack mount servers that we had back in the day. So that's going to be something like these old RS10s. They don't even show these anymore, but these are the replacement versions of the ones that I had. And it was just a way for me to reuse my content, Wayne. That's all it was, or hardware. I had this older hardware and wasn't utilizing it anymore for the reason that we originally bought it. So I have mass storage that I can use and hold things out. I also use that storage to download all my ISOs from like Cassia. So if I come out here, like on this virtual machine, it's just connected over a VM or a Windows share that goes out, and then I can go to my VMs, and I got all the VMs that I've downloaded from Cassia. I use that as a storage system there. I also have an FTP set up so that I can transfer files and move things around. My graduate assistants, when they're building capture the flag activities with me, we use it as shared storage for that too. Let's see. I know that we have Veeam on campus. Would that work? You could use Veeam. There used to be a free community version of Veeam, and so that's how we recommended people do backups. You could do that. The thing is your Veeam that you have for the campus, now you're going to be integrating your setup with the campus VMware infrastructure. So I strongly suggest that you don't do that. You make sure you keep them separate. Honestly, you know, there again, if you need to have weekly backups or you feel like that, then you can definitely use a Veeam type service. For me, it's not that bad to be able to go in there and just do a full clone backup of one of these and send it out to one of my storage. So if I look at these, we can see on the data store that all these backups are just being stored on the NFS storage. If you don't have any kind of SAN or Synology, you simply just do a full clone backup to that RAID that we talked about that's part of your management server. You could do that as well. And then if you wanted, you could pull that down to a USB or something else. Do have a Synology you could reuse. Yeah, the Synology works so slick. Like I said, I've been using them for many, many years, and I love the way they work.
Okay, I think perfect. And then I get up the main and hard it off as well.
I apologize, Wayne. My audio coming in from you is really, really low. Let me mute, and then I'll have you do that again.
Okay, so what I said was I could back it up to the management server and harvest it from there as well, and also try the Synology.
Yep, that's exactly what you could do. Yep.
Okay,
So when I
okay,
come in here, say I'm going to do an update, I just right click clone and just clone my whole VE while it's running. That way I don't have to shut it down. And I just use, you know, the naming structure that you saw there. So VE, this would be 07. Actually, I changed this. I think I went 2021 now. And so let's see, 21. And then when I come out here, because on this host, on my 10 host, I have two different data stores attached, the local storage, and then I have this NFS share. And I just use the NFS on a thin provision, hit next, let it do its thing, and that's it. So I tend to do that, you know, so often because I'm doing updates and things out here. But if you're maintaining, then you can easily go out. And it takes a little bit to clone it. Depends on how big your VE system is. But then I never have to worry about it. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh. And it's all like the Synology is all your level of comfort, right? So if you don't feel comfortable with only having 2 drives of redundancy and you want a 4-drive set up in a RAID 5 or whatever, you could certainly do that. There's nothing keeping you from that. There's other boxes out there too. There's QNAS. There's a bunch of others. I like the Synology software. It's solid. It's robust. These Synology units that we have here, that's the reason we used to recommend them to NetLab customers back in the day when we were suggesting SANs. Is they're just reliable. We use them in our data centers for NDG. I use them in my data center here at Fort Hays. And like I said, I install camera systems on the side, so security camera systems, and the Synologies work fantastic for that. Anybody else have any other questions? All right. Again, I do want to remind you, we are going to have a webinar next week that's covering the API. So if you've never played with the API or you wanted to see what the new version's all about, I definitely encourage you to attend that session. We're going to walk you through building scripts for things like cloning. So for example, if I need to clone out 10 or 20 pods, like what you saw with the packet tracer pods on my setup, I simply just a few numbers in my script, hit go, and it clones off all those pods for me, and it does it really fast. You could use it to tear down. I could use it to pull statistics and information, which is what I do. In my case, since like I mentioned before, we had another institution that rents time from our system. We use that for the quote billing purposes to go find out that student met the requirements for the billing purposes. And being able to generate other logs there too. So really, really handy to use that API. There's a ton of things that you can do. You can write your own scripts for like an LDAP integration. You could write it for pulling statistics out. Number one is just mass pod cloning. That's usually what it's used for. But that will be next week. Outside of that, if nobody else has any other questions or things they'd like to cover, I mean, we still have at least an hour's worth of time here. I can hang on the session here for a little bit. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and end the recording, and hopefully we'll see you some next week. When this is done, I will send emails out to everybody that will have those surveys. Again, please take the time to fill out that survey. It actually does a lot for us if you do. Whether you liked it, didn't like it, be as honest and brutal as possible, because that's what allows us to keep doing these webinars and making sure that we're helping out our instructors and our administrators to utilize NETLAB in the best way. Again, if you have any questions, you can always email our support team, support@netdevgroup.com. If you got something specific about my setup, you can always email me at my Fort Hays email address. If for some reason you're not getting a response, please email support. Support's more than happy to track me down and find me, and we'll get you an answer to your question. All right. I want to thank everybody for their time today. If you come up with other questions or something that we forgot to cover, just send us an email. I'll be happy to respond to those and even schedule some time if we need to.